In the autumn of 1879, on a slow brown bend of the Kootenai River in the northwest corner of Montana Territory, a woman of 28 stood on a rotting plank dock and counted out $3 into a stranger's open palm. The dock swayed under her boots. The boathouse behind it leaned toward the water like a tired animal, its roof half caved, its single great door hanging from one hinge. Men along the riverbank laughed at her, and one of them said she had just bought herself a place to drown. She did not answer them. She folded the receipt the county clerk had scrawled, slid it into the worn brown satchel at her hip, and turned to look at the thing that was now hers. She had $3 left in the world before she paid, and now she had none, and she had a ruin nobody else wanted, and she had the one skill a dead man had spent 11 years teaching her. That, she had decided, would be enough. Her name was Hannah Besford, though by then almost no one used her family name aloud, and the silence around it was its own kind of weight. She had come north from the Bitterroot Valley 3 weeks earlier with a single trunk and a satchel of tools, put out of the house she had grown up in by a brother who had married a woman who did not want a spinster sister underfoot. The leaving had been quiet and final. There had been no shouting, only a packed trunk left on the porch and a stagecoach fare pressed into her hand, and a door that closed before she reached the bottom step. She had learned by then that the cruelest things are often done politely. What the men on the bank did not know as they watched her walk toward the broken boathouse was that the dead man who had taught her was a boatwright named Elias Crane, and that Elias Crane had built half the working craft on 3 rivers, and that he had taught Hannah to read a hull the way other people read a printed page. She knew the grain of cut cedar and the way water finds a weakness. She knew joinery, caulking, the set of a plank, the lie of a seam. And she knew, the moment she had walked the listing floor of that ferry landing 2 days before, and laid her hand flat against the inner wall of the boathouse, that something about the depth of the building was wrong. Stay with me, because what she found behind that wall had been waiting in the dark for 9 years, and a man 200 miles south believed it had rotted to nothing. The ferry landing had a name once. It had been called Marsh Crossing, and for the better part of a decade it had been the only safe place to bring wagons and stock across the Kootenai for 30 miles in either direction. A man named Tom Ardle had run it, a ferryman with a flat-bottomed cable scow and a reputation for fairness, and the boathouse Hannah now owned had been his shop and his shelter, and the place he kept his lines and his winch and his strongbox. Then, 9 years before Hannah arrived, the crossing had simply closed. Tom Ardle had drowned, the county said. His scow had been found swamped and empty a mile downstream, and his body was never recovered, and the landing had passed to the bank that held the note on it, and the bank had let it rot because a closed crossing earns nothing. By the time it came up for tax sale, it was worth, in the county's estimation, exactly $3, and only Hannah had been fool enough to bid. She spent her first night inside it wrapped in 2 blankets against the river, cold, listening to the water move under the floor. The boathouse was built out over the bank on heavy cedar pilings, so that the downstream half of it hung above the river itself, and at night the sound of the current came up through the boards like a voice that would not settle. She did not sleep much. She lay in the dark and ran her mind back over the thing that had caught her attention, the wrongness in the building's depth, and in the gray of first light she rose, stiff and cold, and went to measure it. This is the part the men on the bank could never have done, because they had eyes for a ruin, and Hannah had eyes for a thing made by hands. She paced the outside of the boathouse along the bank, heel to toe, and counted 41 feet from the front corner to the back. Then she went inside and paced the interior the same way, and counted 33. 8 feet had gone missing somewhere inside the length of the building. A careless person would have lost it in the clutter and the dark. Hannah stood very still in the cold and looked at the back wall of the boathouse, a wall of vertical cedar planking gone gray with age, and she understood that it was not the back of the building at all. She thought of Elias then, as she so often did when a problem set itself in front of her. He had been dead 2 years by that autumn, taken by a winter fever in the room above his shop, and she had sat with him at the end. Near the last, he had taken her hand in his own ruined one, the fingers thick and scarred from 50 years of work, and he had told her a thing she had carried ever since. "A boat does not lie to you," he had said, "and neither does a building if you have the patience to let it tell the truth. People lie. Wood only ever tells you what was done to it." She had not fully understood him then. Standing in the cold ruin of the ferry landing, her breath clouding in front of a false wall, she began to. She did not tear into it. That was not how Elias had taught her, and it was not who she was. A man would have taken an axe to it, she thought, and ruined whatever was behind it. In the ruining, she studied it first. She ran her hands along every plank, feeling for the slight proud edges where one board had been fitted more recently than its neighbors. She found, near the floor in the corner farthest from the door, a place where the gray planking had been cut and refitted. The new cuts weathered now but cleaner than the old wood around them. Someone had built this wall in a hurry, but built it to last, and built it to be opened again by someone who knew how. Have you ever held a thing in your hands that you knew was about to change everything and made yourself slow down anyway? Hannah did. She made herself eat first. She made herself build a fire in the rusted stove and warm her hands until the stiffness left her fingers, because cold hands make mistakes and mistakes break things. Only then did she take up the smallest of Elias's chisels and begin to work the seam. The wall did not want to come. 9 winters had swollen the cedar and locked the joints, and the river damp had rusted the cut nails to the thickness of the wood itself. She worked the chisel into the seam a fraction of an inch at a time, tapping it with the heel of her hand rather than a mallet, feeling for the give. She had learned the trick of it in Elias's shop, where he had made her open and reseat 100 swollen planks before he let her touch a hull that would carry a man, saying that the work taught the hands a patience the head could not. The cedar gave grudgingly. She would set the chisel, feel the fiber resist, ease the pressure, and try the seam an inch along where the grain ran kinder. Twice the chisel slipped and bit into the meat of her thumb, and she steadied it, and began again, sucking the blood away and going on. The light moved across the floor as the morning wore on, a pale band creeping from the gaps in the planking toward the cold iron of the stove. She worked through the noon hour without noticing it pass, and her shoulders burned, and a blister opened across the meat of her right palm, and she wrapped it in a strip of cloth and kept on. She counted her progress not in hours, but in nails freed, and there were 11 of them down the seam. And she drew each one with a cat's paw she had brought from the north and laid them in a row on the bench as though they were worth keeping, because Elias had taught her that a salvaged nail is a nail you do not have to forge. By the middle of the afternoon she had freed the first plank, and she set it aside as carefully as if it were glass, and she looked into the dark behind it, and she felt the cold come out at her. It was a different cold than the river cold. It was still air that had been shut away from the moving world for a long time, and it smelled of dust and old iron and something faintly of pitch. She could see nothing in the dark. She freed a second plank and a third, working until the gap was wide enough to pass through, and then she lit a lantern and held it up and leaned her head and shoulders into the space that the false wall had hidden, and she went very still. It was a room, a narrow room 8 feet deep and the full width of the boathouse, built into the overhanging half so that its floor was the floor that hung above the river. And it was not empty. Against the far wall under a tarpaulin, gone stiff and gray, stood the unmistakable shape of a strong-box, and beside it a workbench, and on the bench, laid out as though the man who used them had only stepped away for a moment, a row of tools. A ferryman's tools, and tacked to the wall above the bench, curled, and yellow but whole, were papers. She did not go in at once. She knelt at the gap with the lantern and looked for a long while because Elias had taught her that a thing left untouched has a story in its arrangement and that you read the arrangement before you disturb it. The dust on the floor was undisturbed. The tarpaulin had not been moved in years. Whatever had been sealed into this room had been sealed in haste and never reclaimed, and the man who sealed it had not come back, and Hannah, kneeling in the cold with her wrapped and bleeding hand, understood that she was almost certainly looking at the last work of Tom Ardle, the drowned ferryman, who the county said had died 9 years before with nothing to his name but a swamped boat. What she did not yet know was that Tom Ardle had not died with nothing. He had died trying to protect something, and the something was still here, and the reason the crossing had been allowed to rot was the same reason the wall had been built, and a man named Royce Devlin, 200 miles south in Helena, had spent 9 years believing that reason was safely drowned. Hannah climbed through the gap. The hidden floor felt sound under her weight, which told her something about the man who had built it, and she crossed to the bench and lifted the lantern to the papers on the wall. They were ferry records. Crossing logs, in a careful hand, dates and names and the tally of what each party paid, going back years. And beneath them, unrolled and pinned flat, was a map of the river and the land along it, and the land was marked in lots, and the lots had names written against them, and Hannah read the names slowly in the lantern light and felt the shape of something large and wrong begin to assemble itself in the cold. She was not a woman given to haste, and she did not understand all of it that first day. She understood enough, though, to know that she had not bought a place to drown. She had bought a sealed room with a dead man's truth in it, and the truth had teeth. Let me tell you about Royce Devlin, because Hannah would spend the coming weeks learning what he was, and you should know it as she came to know it in pieces. In the years Tom Ardle ran his crossing, the land on the western bank of the Kootenai had been settled by some 40 families, homesteaders who had filed their claims honestly and broken the ground and built their cabins and meant to stay. The crossing was their lifeline to the markets south. And Royce Devlin had been the man who held the bank in the territory's capital, a man who lent against land and held the paper on a great deal of it, and who understood, as such men do, that paper is power. When the railroad survey came north in the late 60s and the rumor went out that a line might be run up the Kootenai Valley, Devlin had understood before anyone what that would make the Western Bank worth. And he had set about acquiring it. He had not done it with guns. He had done it with foreclosures and tax liens and disputed titles, with deadlines that arrived in the mail too late to meet, and payments that were recorded as missed when they had been made. One by one the honest families had been served, papers they could not fight, and one by one their claims had passed to a holding company whose true owner, behind 2 other names, was Royce Devlin. By the time anyone understood what was happening, most of the Western Bank belonged to him on paper, and the families who had broken the ground were gone, scattered south and east, dispossessed and called debtors. Tom Ardle, though, had seen it happening from his crossing. The ferryman saw everyone who came and went. He saw the families leave with their wagons piled high, and their faces gray, and he had talked to them at his landing, and being a careful man, he had begun to keep more than ferry records. He had kept a second ledger. In it he recorded what the families told him, the payments they swore they had made, the dates, the amounts, the names of the men who had taken their money and given no receipt. He had done one thing more, the thing that made him dangerous. He had gotten hold of original receipts, the real ones, signed by Devlin's own agents, that the families had been told were lost, and that proved the foreclosures were fraud. How Tom Ardle came to have those receipts, Hannah would learn later from an old woman who remembered. The ferryman had told the families to bring him anything Devlin's men had signed, and he would keep it safe because a ferry landing held by the bank was the last place the bank would think to look, and because Tom Ardle was stubborn and honest and had decided that someone ought to keep the truth where it could not be burned. He had built the false wall himself, in a hurry. The autumn, the pressure came down on him, and he had sealed his second ledger and the receipts and his crossing logs into the dark behind it. And then, before he could carry the truth to anyone who could act on it, his scow had been found swamped and empty a mile downstream, and Tom Ardle was gone. Hannah did not believe the river took him. She came to that belief slowly, the way she came to all her beliefs, by weighing what she could see. A ferryman who had run a cable scow for a decade did not drown in his own crossing in fair weather. She could prove nothing about his death, though, and she knew it, and so she set that question aside and bent herself to the thing she could prove, which was what lay behind the wall. For 3 days she worked in the hidden room, and the work was the careful, patient kind that no one watching from the bank would have called work at all. She did not haul or heave. She catalogued, she copied. By lantern light and by the gray river light that came through the gaps she had opened, she went through every paper Tom Ardle had sealed away. And she read them, and she understood them, and she began to make a fair copy of the whole of it in her own hand, because Elias had taught her that a single record can be lost or burned. But a record, copied and kept in 2 places, is far harder to kill. The strong box under the tarpaulin she left for last. It was locked, an iron box the size of a small trunk, and the key was not on the bench or the wall or anywhere she could find. A man would have broken it open. Hannah studied the lock instead, and recognized the make, a warded box lock of a pattern Elias had owned 3 of, and remembered that he had kept a tin of lockpicks in the bottom of his tool chest, and had taught her their use one slow winter when there was no other work, saying that a boatwright who could not let himself into his own locked shop was no kind of craftsman. She had the tin still. She drew the fine steel picks from it and knelt before the box in the lantern light and set to work reading the lock by feel, the way she read a swollen seam. The wards were stiff with rust and fought her. She worked a few drops of oil into the keyhole from the small can in her satchel, and waited, sitting back on her heels in the cold, while the oil crept down into the works, and then she tried it again. She felt the first ward give, then the second, then the bolt resist where the rust had welded it half across, and she did not force it. She eased it back, and worked more oil into the seam of the bolt, and waited again, and on the third trying the bolt drew with a small, reluctant shriek of iron, and the lid came free. It took her the better part of an evening, and she was glad of every minute it had cost, because a thing worth hiding behind a wall in a locked box was a thing worth opening with care. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, was the heart of the whole matter, the original receipts. 40 of them and more, signed and dated, each one the proof that a family the territory called debtors had in fact paid what they owed, and had been robbed of their land by a man who recorded their payments as missed. She sat with the open box a long time. The lantern guttered. The river moved under the floor. And Hannah Besford, who had been put out of her own home with a stagecoach fare and a closed door, looked at 40 stolen homes laid out in a dead man's careful hand, and felt something harden in her that was not anger exactly, but was close kin to it. She had been dismissed as worthless and had bought a thing called worthless for $3, and the thing called worthless held the proof that would undo the man who had taught a whole valley what worthless meant. Proof, though, is only proof if it reaches a hand that can use it, and Hannah was a stranger in the country, a woman alone, with no standing and no name anyone respected, and she understood that if she walked into the county seat with an armload of papers and a story about a false wall, she would be laughed at the way the men on the bank had laughed at her. She needed someone the country would believe. She needed, she thought, to find the families. The old woman's name was Cordelia Pratt, and she lived 4 miles up the western bank, in a soddy she refused to leave, the last of the original settlers, who had not been driven all the way out. Hannah found her by asking at the one store that still stood near the dead crossing, and she walked the 4 miles with a fair copy of the second ledger wrapped in oilcloth under her arm. The soddy was low and dim and smelled of earth and wood smoke, and the old woman sat by a small fire with a shawl over her knees and watched Hannah come in with the flat, unsurprised attention of a person who has outlived surprise. Hannah did not waste the old woman's time with softening. She sat at the rough table, and she unwrapped the oilcloth, and she laid the truth out between them and said plainly what it was. Cordelia Pratt was near 80, and her hands shook and her eyes did not, and she drew the ledger toward her and read it slowly, her finger moving down the names, her lips shaping each one without sound. When she came to a name near the middle, she stopped, and her shaking hand went still on the page, and she said, in a voice gone quiet, that the name was her son's, and that her son had sworn until the day he gave up and went south that he had paid, and that no one had believed him, and that he had died 3 years back, still called a debtor. Hannah said nothing for a while. She had learned from Elias that there are moments when the only decent thing is silence, and that a craftsman knows the difference between a silence that is empty and a silence that is full. The fire ticked. The old woman's finger stayed on her son's name as though she could press the lie out of it by touch alone. Then Hannah said plainly that she had the original receipts, the real ones, and that among them was very likely one with the old woman's son's name on it, and that it proved he had told the truth. Cordelia Pratt looked up at her then, and her eyes searched Hannah's face for the catch in it, the cruelty that experience had taught her to expect, and found none. And the old woman who had not wept at her son's leaving or at his dying put her face in her shaking hands and wept then, and Hannah sat with her in the dim earthen room and led her, and understood that whatever else came of this, that one thing had already been worth the doing. Ward moves in a thin country the way water moves through cracked ground. Slowly, and then all at once. Cordelia Pratt knew where some of the scattered families had gone. She had a granddaughter in Helena, a young woman named Esther, who clerked for a law office and could read a deed, and she sent Hannah south with a letter of introduction in her own shaking hand, and the warning that Helena was Devlin's town, and that Hannah should trust no one she did not have to. Hannah did not want to go to Helena. The hidden room felt safer than any town, and the work of it suited her. The proof was useless sealed in a boathouse, though, and so she packed the original receipts and her fair copies into the false bottom of her trunk, a false bottom she built herself in an afternoon with the skill Elias had given her, fitting it so close that the join did not show, and she took the long stage south, with the truth writing under her spare clothes. I want you to sit with what she was carrying, because it was not gold, though it was worth more than gold to the people it concerned. It was paper. It was the proof that ordinary people had been telling the truth, and had been called liars by a man with a bank, and that is a thing worth a great deal in a world that so seldom lets the dismissed be proven right. Esther Pratt was 23 and sharp as a fresh chisel, and she read the receipts in a single evening by the light of her own lamp and understood at once what Hannah had brought her. She had clerked in the territory's law offices long enough to know how a fraud of this kind was built, and more to the point, how it could be unbuilt. The receipts alone were enough to reopen a single foreclosure. The second ledger, cross-referenced against the county's own recorded foreclosure dates, was enough to show a pattern. And a pattern, Esther said, her voice low and even in the lamplight, was the difference between one family getting a hearing and the whole fraud coming down. There was a man, Esther told her, a federal land agent newly posted to the territory, sent up precisely because Washington had begun to hear rumors of fraudulent patents along the rail surveys. He was not Devlin's creature. He was, in fact, the one official in the territory who had reason to want exactly what Hannah carried. His name was Marcus Hale, and he was the single titled authority in this whole account, and he was careful and skeptical and not at all inclined to act on the word of an unknown woman and a law clerk's granddaughter. Until Hannah laid the original receipts on his desk and let him hold them up to the light and see the signatures of Devlin's own agents on the paper Devlin had sworn was lost. He was quiet a long while. Then he asked her how she had come by them, and Hannah told him plainly about the false wall and the sealed room and the $3. And Hale, who had spent a career learning to tell a true account from a false one, recognized the unornamented shape of the truth. He told her he would need the second ledger and the crossing logs as well, all of it, and that it would take months, and that Devlin would not sit still while it happened, and that she should understand the risk she had already taken and would go on taking. Hannah said she understood. She did not tell him that a man put out of his own house with a closed door has already lost the thing other people are most afraid of losing, and so has less to fear. She thought it, though. Devlin did not sit still. Hannah had known he would not. Within a month of her visit to the land office, word reached her up north where she had returned to keep the rest of the records safe. That men had come asking in the county seat about the woman who had bought the ferry landing and what she had found in it and where she kept it. She had expected this, and she had prepared for it in the patient way she prepared for everything. She had not left the proof in the boathouse. She had copied everything twice over, and the originals were with Hale under federal seal, and one full copy was with Esther in Helena, and the second copy she had hidden in a place no searcher would think to look, sealed behind a second false wall she had built herself in the soddy of Cordelia Pratt, fitted with the same close skill. Because Elias had taught her that the best hiding place is one that looks like nothing at all. The men who came to the boathouse came at night, which told Hannah what kind of men they were. She was not there when they came. She had moved to a room in the store, 4 miles up the bank, precisely because she had reckoned they would come. And in the morning she walked down to the dead crossing and found the false wall torn out with an axe, the careful seams she had opened, now splintered and ruined, the hidden room ransacked. The strongbox flung open and empty of everything but the oilcloth. They had found nothing, because there had been nothing left to find. They had wrecked a dead man's careful work for an empty box. And Hannah stood in the wreckage of it and felt the loss of the craftsmanship more than the fright, because the room had been well made, and now it was broken, and broken things grieved her. The wrecking told its own truth, though, and Hale understood it when she sent him word. Innocent men do not send axes in the night after empty rooms. The ransacking was in its way a confession, and Hale added it to the weight he was assembling, and the weight grew. The months Esther had warned of came and went. Winter closed the river, and Hannah stayed north, and she did not idle. She repaired the boathouse. It was hers after all, and she could not abide a broken thing she had the skill to mend, and so through the short cold days she set new pilings and trued the leaning frame and rehung the great door on hinges she forged herself in the rusted stove. Setting the pilings was the worst of it, and the best. She cut the new cedar from a stand a half-mile up the bank and snaked the logs down to the water on a sledge of her own making, and she worked them into the river bottom through holes she broke in the shore ice, standing to her knees in water cold enough to stop the breath, driving each piling with a maul until it rang solid against the gravel below. She allowed herself an hour of that at a time, and no more, because Elias had taught her that cold is a thief that takes the hands first and the judgment second. Then she would climb out and stand by the stove until the feeling came back into her fingers in a slow burning ache, and drink coffee black and scalding, and go back out. It took her 11 days to set 6 pilings. When the last one stood plumb and would not shift against her shoulder, she rested her forehead against the cold, wet wood of it and was, for a moment, purely glad. By the spring, the ferry landing that the county had valued at $3 stood square and sound for the first time in 9 years. She did not rebuild the false wall. She left the hidden room open and clean, and she set Tom Arnold's tools back on the bench where she had found them, because it seemed to her the right way to honor a man who had built a thing to keep the truth safe, and died for it. The reckoning, when it came, did not come as a confrontation. Hannah was never in a room with Royce Devlin. She never raised her voice to him or saw his face. This is worth telling, because the country had been taught to expect that wrongs were answered with a showdown in the street, and this wrong was answered another way. It was answered with paper, the same weapon Devlin had used, turned now against him by a federal land agent with original receipts under seal and a ferryman's second ledger and the recorded confession of axe marks in the night. The patents Devlin had obtained along the western bank were challenged one by one, and then all together, and the holding company behind two other names was opened up like a strongbox, and the name at the bottom of it was read aloud at last in a court of record. Devlin himself was undone, not in a single dramatic hour, but in the slow way that such men are truly undone, by the foundation going out from under everything he had built. The fraudulent titles were voided. The bank, which had stood on them, faltered. By the time the last of it played out, the man who had called a whole valley worthless and debtor was himself called something far worse in the territory's papers, and he left Helena. And where he went, Hannah neither knew nor cared. He became as such men always finally become irrelevant. The truth had not needed him present to undo him. It had only needed to be brought into the light by a hand patient enough to free it. What mattered to Hannah was not Devlin's fall. It was the family's. Through the spring and into the summer, the foreclosures were reopened, and the receipts spoke for the dead and the scattered, and the land along the western bank began, slowly, to be made right. It could not be made whole. Some of the families could not be found, and some who could be found had built new lives elsewhere and did not want to come back to ground that had cost them so much grief, and some, like Cordelia Pratt's son, were past any restitution but the clearing of their name. The names were cleared, though the record was set right, and those who wanted to come home were given the means to, and some of them came. Cordelia Pratt lived to see her son's name cleared in the county record, his payment acknowledged, his honesty entered where the lie had been. She did not live much past it. She died that autumn in the soddy she had refused to leave, and Hannah was with her at the end, and helped lay her to rest on the bank above the river, and afterward took down the second false wall she had built in the old woman's house, and gave the soddy back to the granddaughter who came north to claim it. Esther kept it. She said she did not want to clerk in Devlin's town any longer, and that there was honest work for a person who could read a deed in a country that was learning, slowly, to trust its own records again. Hannah stayed at the crossing. That surprised some people, who thought a woman who had brought down a banker might want a banker's kind of reward, but Hannah had never been after that, and was not after it now. She had been after the truth and the restitution, and the proof that a dismissed person could be proven right, and she had those things, and they were enough. The land office, at Hale's recommendation, granted her clear title to the ferry landing and a sum in recognition of what she had recovered, and she used most of the sum, not on herself but on the crossing, because the crossing wanted to live again. By the next summer, the cable scow ran across the Kootenai once more, and Marsh Crossing was a crossing again, and the families coming home north used it, and Hannah Besford ran it, the way Tom Ardle had, fairly and well. She was not a ferryman by trade, but she was a boatwright, and a boatwright can learn a ferry quickly enough, and the work suited her solitary nature. She kept Tom Ardle's tools on the bench in the open room where the false wall had been, and she added Elias Cranes beside them, and the two dead men who had taught her everything she knew kept her company in their way. She was alone, but she was not lonely in the manner the men on the bank had once predicted, because a person with work she respects and a truth she has served is a different kind of alone than a person who has only been thrown away. The men who had laughed at her $3 came around in time the way such men do. They did not apologize exactly. That was not the country's way. One of them, though, the one who had said she had bought a place to drown, brought his wagon and his team down to the rebuilt crossing one morning the second summer, and paid his fare to cross, and, looking up at the square-sound boathouse and the new pilings, and the great door hung true, said only that she had made something of it after all. Hannah took his coin and worked the scow across and said that she had. She did not say more. The work had already said everything that needed saying, and Elias had taught her that a craftsman lets the work speak and keeps her own mouth shut, and she had always been a good student. Have you ever watched someone the whole world wrote off turn out to be the only one who was right? Tell me about a time you saw it. And if this kind of story stays with you, the slow kind where patience and a pair of skilled hands undo what power and a lie could not, there are others like it waiting for you here. On a still evening late in her first full year as ferryman, Hannah Besford sat on the bench in the open room above the river, the room a dead man had built to keep the truth safe. And she worked oil into the worn handle of Elias Crane's smallest chisel, the one she had used to free the first plank of the false wall. The river moved under the floor the way it always had, but it did not sound to her now like a voice that would not settle. It sounded like a thing going where it was meant to go. Across the water, the lamps of the returning family showed yellow. Against the dark of the western bank, the bank that had been called worthless and was not, and Hannah set the chisel down on the bench beside the dead men's tools, and listened to the river carry the lamplight south, and was content. The crossing she had bought for $3 was worth. The territory now agreed a great deal. That had never been the measure of it, though, and Hannah knew the true measure, and kept it, the way she kept everything that mattered, quietly, and where it could not be taken from her.